title of the talk is now Archaeology and Occupy-Occupied Relationship. As you know, it happens, things change. But I would like to start with thanking the organizers because, you know, we have been waiting for this day for a very, very long time, and they worked really, really hard. So I'm thankful. The second thing I want to say is that I'm really glad that my paper is the paper that opens this conference because, like, let's face it, you know, when I say the occupation of Istanbul, archaeology is not the first thing that pops to mind. So it kind of speaks to what Daniel was saying, that like how the field has changed throughout the years. So now on to the paper. I think we can all agree that when the occupation began, the city was not in the greatest shape. The fires, the refugees, the housing issue, the diseases, bureaucratic problems, political issues, which we're all going to cover in the next 3 days. So in my question, guiding this paper is that in the middle of all this, allies engaged in archaeology. They did excavations. Why? And what did they do with the finds that they found in this excavations? And what the Ottomans were doing while they were doing excavations. So to answer all of those, here we go. Yeah, this wonderful state of the city. So in order to answer like why they were engaged in archaeology, I have to start with the war, because in terms of archaeology, there are important overlaps between like what happened during the war and after. So all the parties that fought on the Ottoman lands during the war carried out archaeological preservation and protection activities throughout the war, including the Ottomans. So why did they do that in this middle of horrible war and later in the occupation? And I offer few answers. First, to stake territorial claims or at least delineate a zone of influence. Second, to legitimize their occupation. And the third, to take advantage of an exceptional opportunity that is kind of twofold. On the one hand, to produce knowledge, this access, the occupation that gives this amazing access that is usually elusive if you want to deal with Ottoman antiquities. It's also an exceptional opportunity because it allows Europeans and Americans to send antiquities back home. So I said that talking about archaeology in occupation is like perhaps not the obvious choice, but it should. Archaeology and armies have a very, very long history. From Napoleon's occupation of Egypt and the French and Italian colonial expansion in North Africa, archaeology played important roles in legitimizing these acts. And not only do they claim ownership of these pasts via religious reasoning, holy lands and all that, or historical cultural connections, they also claimed that they are the only ones who are capable of properly studying and caring for these antiquities. During the war, for example, in the East, when the Russians came in, they asserted their claim to be the legitimate heirs to the Byzantine Empire and conducted excavations up until 1917. In her wonderful thesis talks about these things. It's really wonderful. In 1919, when the Greek army occupied the western coast, they were accompanied by a group of archaeologists who collected a lot of finds to prove the essential Greekness of the lands. And meanwhile, Italians, who had a long interest in those same territories, attempted to establish their own historical claim through archaeological studies. And this will not come as a surprise to anybody. The Italians studied the Roman past, of course, to make the same claims. The Allies also tried to accomplish these same goals through civilizing mission tactics that we all come to know and love throughout the years. For example, the French military established a museum in Adana, as if there was nothing there. It was like a tabula rasa situation. And the Italians established a museum in Antalya. According to the French colonel in charge of the museum in Adana, it was the French thing to do to create a museum in order to protect antiquities. The museums were presented as having civilized the occupied lands and show the importance of protecting local antiquities. The presumed acceptance of the museums by the locals, it was implied, legitimized foreign occupation. The occupation was framed as an exceptional opportunity, in the words of the director of the British Museum, Sir Frederick Kenyon, for British interests and the archaeological research in general. Similar sentiments were voiced by famous American archaeologist Francis Kelsey, preparing an expedition in 1919, aiming to, and I quote, lure Greek, Syriac, Persian, and Armenian manuscripts from unappreciated lands, and to provide proper preservation, end quote, to serve science and like this kind of like salvage mentality. I'm very, very thankful to Hegnar Vattenfall for giving me this quote, and I'm so stoked that she's actually here. It's so great. While the war was going on, the British were already conducting excavations in Mesopotamia, the French in Gallipoli, and they were shipping their finds and therefore breaching international and Ottoman laws back to, they were sending their finds to Britain and France. They were breaching international laws because Article 56 of 1899 Hague Convention states that the historical monuments and works of art and science are prohibited to be taken away, basically. And British, French, and the Ottomans, they were all signatories to this Hague Convention. They were breaking the Ottoman laws because Ottoman antiquities laws declared all antiquities to be the state property and banned their exploitation. Any excavations conducted in Ottoman soil required a permit and a presence of an Ottoman inspector to excavation sites. So let's turn now our attention to Istanbul. In Istanbul, it was the French who conducted excavations from 1920 onwards, working in Gülhane and Bakırköy of today on Byzantine remains. Why the French? Short answer is possibly that the Army of the Orient already, the French Army of the Orient already established an archaeological service back in Thessaloniki and the Macedonian campaign in 1916, and perhaps it was also because of the willingness and availability of the French archaeologists around, basically. And why did they choose those locations? Why Bakırköy? Why Gülhane? Because the area around the palace, Topkapı Palace, was given to the French as a part of their encampment. In 1921, this placement, coupled with the French appreciation of wine and an extreme heat wave, it created conditions for the French excavations in the Gülhane area, basically. So French facing this heat wave in the city, they wanted to find a cool place to store the wine, the famous Pinar, to be rationed to the soldiers. What they discovered in subterranean caves of the Marmara seaside led to the excavations around the arsenal of manganese, and they did a lot of amphoras and like they had lots of finds. In Bakırköy, there we go. The placement of the French troops also played a role again. The French were placed in the Ottoman barracks, and Ottomans, when these Ottomans, when they were building this barracks back in 1914, they did come across Byzantine ruins, and Makili Bey from the Imperial Museum did actually do a report on it. And during the occupation, it was the French who were placed there in the same barracks during the occupation, and the French archaeologist Charles Picard, together with Makili Bey, worked on an excavation. So the location, the French love of wine, these happy little like historical accidents and also the fact that these were like Byzantine sites, which French had expertise and familiarity and affinity perhaps due to like historical, cultural, and political reasons, all contributed to these excavations. But perhaps the most important factor enabling the excavations in Istanbul was the access to the city that the occupation provided. So what do we see here in terms of the occupier-occupied relationship? What does this access provide? Is it just military might opens all doors? Is that the thing? This is a very difficult dynamic we're talking about. The top Ottoman archaeological authorities, Halil Bey, Mahdi Bey, and these French archaeologists knew each other. They knew each other well, they worked together before the war and during the occupation. They were colleagues. Furthermore, the Ottoman officials engaged in civil gestures throughout the occupation with the occupation forces. Nonetheless, we were talking about a changing power dynamic between the Ottoman authorities and the foreign archaeologists during the occupation. So because of that, the nature of French excavations became contentious. For example, there was the issue of permission. The French argued that the excavations were mutually agreed upon by General Sharpie and the director of the Ottoman Imperial Museum, Halil Efem, via exchange of letters. I could not find such letters at the archives. Let me know if you ever come across it at the Archives French Archives, just like email me. But as far as what I've found so far is that Halil Bey was upset about not being notified and brought the issue to the General Sharpie and demanded, and I quote, "Şifahen izahat ve müsaadesiz icra olan hafriyatın tatbiki." So he demanded an explanation and the cessation of these excavations. But interestingly, the evidence showed that French sent antiquities that they excavated in Istanbul to the Imperial Museum and not to France. And they did this type of thing elsewhere in the empire, but also in Greece during the Macedonian campaign. So they had done this illegally everywhere. For example, so this is a picture from the French excavations done during the occupation in Gallipoli. There were two, and here I do know that their finds were sent to the Louvre for certain. I don't know if all of them or it's like a portion of them, but definitely there are pieces from this excavation in Louvre today. So we see that the occupiers were not able to do whatever they wanted, basically, like sending antiquities they found back from Istanbul. Why? Why was Istanbul under occupation special? I can offer a lot of reasons. First, unlike the Arab provinces, the Allies had not made concrete territorial claims on Istanbul. Also, they did not have a clear prediction of Istanbul's future status. They needed to ensure a long-term workable relationship with the Ottoman archaeological authorities. For example, the French wanted to establish a school of archaeology in Istanbul, and negotiations began in this period. Thirdly, in Istanbul, their civilizing mission argument, especially in Istanbul, made not much sense because the city already had a major museum, and the Ottomans had already established many initiatives to preserve and protect antiquities even during the war. Furthermore, the Ottomans pressured the Allies constantly, writing frequent reports and keeping detailed records about what's going on. And they repeatedly transmitted official complaints and urged the Allied High Commissioners to transport newly found antiquities to the Imperial Museum. Finally, in Istanbul, we were talking about Istanbul, and it was under an international spotlight. The world was watching. And the Allied forces did not want the world to view them as barbarians. And because during the war, Germans did damage a lot of cultural heritage, what we call cultural heritage today, and this was used as a propaganda against the Germans. So this concern about this international perception of their activities was linked to a wartime shift in public attitudes regarding the protection of cultural heritage. So the Ottomans were able to stop expatriation during the occupation in Istanbul, but the Allies kept pushing too. They kept demanding things. For example, the British really wanted to find out if Germans took anything during the war and pestered Kadir Has about it. Even Faisal, son of Sharif Hussein of Mecca, demanded the holy relics from the Arab provinces back. Meanwhile, the Ottomans were trying to at least monitor archaeological activities in other areas under occupation outside Istanbul, because there were also multiple reports coming from the local Ottoman officials watching and documenting, for example, the Italian archaeological activities in the south. Ottomans were making counter demands, on the other hand, like asking allies to stop Greeks from taking antiquities. So the Ottomans were very busy and very overwhelmed. The occupation, of course, made things very difficult for the Ottomans and thus limited their negotiation power. The power of the occupiers is evident by Halil Ethem's drafting of a new antiquities law, Azar-ı Atika Kanunu Rahiyası, in 1921. And this was in the Ceren Treaty that the Ottomans needed to write a new one too, so he had to oblige under the occupation. So this bill encompassed many of the characteristics of the older Ottoman antiquities laws, with one exception. Even though all antiquities were declared to belong to the empire, one of the articles allowed the partition of these finds, and another article allowed a portion to be taken abroad. The practice of partition has been prohibited since 1884, basically. And the historical context of Allied occupation of Ottoman lands is glaring. So even though that's the push, we can see the push, but we can see the counter push in this Lahiya too. We see that they try to put limits, try to complicate the permission processes and all that. So we can surmise that the Ottoman authorities who were writing this new law were under pressure from occupying forces and tried their best to limit European abilities to take away antiquities. So in sum, the Allies gained an advantage during the joint occupation of Istanbul, and the Ottomans, who had a limited arsenal of strategies to deploy against them, oscillated between collaboration and negotiation in an effort to control the flow of antiquities outside the empire. On the one hand, the occupiers had enough power to disregard Ottoman law while conducting archaeological excavations outside Istanbul, while also pushing for a new antiquities law. On the other hand, they were reluctant to ship archaeological finds from Istanbul to abroad and sought Ottoman approval of their activities. All of this points towards a very interesting power dynamic in the occupied city of Istanbul. Halil Ethem's antiquities draft bill was never put into effect as the political and military climates changed as Allies left the city in 1923. And despite all the talk about the international protection of antiquities, a comprehensive law to protect cultural heritage in armed conflict would have to wait until the end of the Second World War. Thank you.